he couldn't punish me. Something that I was saying meant something to him. It was the last time Captain Obembe just used his koboko anyhow. So I learned something. My schoolmates learned something. If we had not challenged Captain Obembe, he would have continued to use the koboko, whether we liked it or not, whether we did wrong or did right, it didn't matter. It was confusing us. Bad behavior. People invited by the Africa Leadership Forum, as a think tank was taking foothold, and it was bringing in young people, professionals like me from countries, and at the leadership forum you would learn a lot of things, and I was writing an op-ed about governance issues. At the end of the day, I became one of the co-founders of Transparency International at that time, and also it coincided with the time of militarization, the tail end of it, because the then president Babangida had been forced by citizens' agitation to do an election. After that election, decided to annul it. And that brought an awakening on the part of professionals like never before seen in Nigeria. Because the likes of Atedo Peter's side, Patu Tommy, Sam Oni, Maureen Babalola, Ayo Igodaro, Asu Igodalo, there was the different parts of us. Waziri, who was he was chairman, best known as chairman of railway, that died in that air crash. Yes, so we were the concerned professionals, people like you who were doing so well with their lives, never paid attention to issues of governance. At least in my own case, I had a history of doing that. But a lot of what concerned professionals was really about people who hitherto at that time, prior to that time, didn't take any interest, didn't want to say any word about issues of poor governance or corruption or demand for accountability, but suddenly saying, how can you annul an election that was free and fair? How? And so it became a movement of professionals, and we would go out on the street to demonstrate and say the election needed to be restored, the results needed to be fully called, and that his mandate needed to be restored. That agitation was quite something. We got beaten on the streets. Like when professionals were all, in those days, you call professionals young, upwardly mobile. That's what we used to be. Yuppies. You people don't know that kind of language now. That is very old and dated. But that's our own slang for our generation, yuppies. So they beat. I said to the young people, I said, you think you know SARS? Our own time it was called kill and go. It was mobile police. They would roll the tank and it would be something else. So I'm saying all of this in order to show you how far back the issue of poor governance has been at the center of the things that have mattered to me. And, fast forward, I had ended up in having to go to Germany as the government became even more terrible. One of the days that Mrs. Kudirat and Piola had to go to court concerning her husband's mandate, we used to, just go also as concerned professionals to be there to support. And on one of those days, she was going to court. I was on my way to the Igoshere High Court, and the then acting High Commissioner of Canada called me, Joel Olsen, and said, "Obi, where are you?" And I said, "I'm on my way to the court," because he knew we were going to be. He said, "Okay, maybe you want to be going home." And I said, "Why?" He said, "They've just shot Kudirat Abiola and she's dead." was a new one ever in Nigeria. I mean, like, they had done a lot of things, you know, but to kill a woman on the streets of Lagos was a different level, entirely different level. Oh, my mom went ballistics because she had just lost her husband some months, and she was like, no. It had become terrible. I mean, it had gone to a new dimension. And then, you know, most of the people in the concerned professionals began to say, you know, maybe we should, you know, professionals. So much to lose. Let's maybe, maybe, you know, maybe. And
should be more professional.
Yeah. So, you know, our numbers just dwindled following that. And then the next thing was, you know, Transparency International said you have to, and then President Obasanjo was one of the co-founders, and he was chairman of the advisory board. I was one of the co-founders and pioneer members of the board, of the global board. And so they first picked him and put him away in jail, and you know, for for planning a coup, that phantom, you know, accusation of a coup. And then the Transparency International could see, because I still was bouncing around the place telling the government how we were going to find all the money they were stealing, and we were going to, you know, so it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. TI said, you know, we don't want to lose we don't want to lose you. We need you to actually be a voice for the kind of international action that is necessary to get your country out of the grips of dictatorship. So I had to go to Berlin, and going to Berlin was one of the toughest things that I had to do as a wife, as a mother, as a daughter. But then we had to do Berlin. And then from Berlin to I stayed briefly in the UK also, and then ended up in the US, where I then went to Harvard University, and then began to work with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, and kept saying that our country would turn around, as I became the mouthpiece of, you know, the advocacy, especially as it concerned the poor governance, lack of transparency aspect of militarization. We ended up, through the providence of God, getting our democracy back 1999. It wasn't until end of 2000 that I had to go home. And why did I go home? Because we had been doing some work at the Kennedy School, Professor Sachs and myself. He became so excited about Nigeria because of he called it my contagious optimism about my country. That even when we were going through that terrible period, I kept telling him, we're going to be fine, we will be fine. And he would say, your country is a basket case. And I would say, just wait and see what will happen in my country. So he said, a brutal dictator is in charge of your country, Obi. Why don't you just get real? I said, just wait and see what will happen. I had no idea, but I knew that I'm a strong woman of faith. And I was just declaring that it would be fine. And one day, it was fine. We got democracy. So he now felt obliged to help in our democracy. So with his contacts with President Clinton at that time, we then began to do a debt sustainability analysis at Harvard, at the Center for International Development, to show that we were doing it to show that Nigeria's democracy would not be sustainable if the world did not help Nigeria to address the shrunk state of the fiscal possibilities of Nigeria. Nigeria was spending about 7 times what is spent on health, or what is spent on health to service the debt, about 8 times what is spent on education to service the debt. It was not a sustainable prospect. And so that caught the attention and imagination of President Clinton, but the Congress as well as the Treasury were not persuaded. They wouldn't go with him. And so we didn't make progress with that. So we then said, what could persuade concerning Nigeria? Because if a leading country as an creditor like the US, just puts an X on such a prospect, all the other countries will fall in line with it. That's the way the global community works. So we said we needed to find some evidence to track something that has changed, so that, because what the Treasury and Congress said was that, it amounts to moral hazard to give a debt reduction to a country that uses its own resources badly, because it's basically rewarding bad behavior. So we needed to find evidence. That was what took me home. That evidence to do the kind of reform that will enable us to track evidence that Nigeria has started using its resources better, was what took me home to go and do the reform of the public procurement system.
Due process.
Do you understand that? It was a journey home to do that particular work. As part of, I became by then I had been announced as the director of the Nigeria Harvard Economic Strategy Program. It was on the basis of that I went to be there for 18 months. I ended up being there for 6.5 years, because we by the time we did the due process work and then worked on the act, the Public Procurement Act, and the bureau that it birthed, and then had to do the Nigeria Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, NEITI, then solid minerals, and then education. And in all of those assignments, the consistency that you would see is basically that the heart of it was good governance. Good governance was the heart of it. Every aspect of it was toward good governance. And that defined my work. And so by the time I left government because I was headhunted by the then president of the World Bank, Wolfowitz, who wanted a very strong candidate that would compete in the internal and external recruitment process to hire the vice president for the Africa region. And I didn't want to go to the World Bank because I used to picket the World Bank for not caring to focus on transparency, accountability, and anti-corruption issues. But I was persuaded to do that recruitment process. And after the process, he said, there's no other candidate I want than you. It took a lot for me to eventually be persuaded to agree to go. And then we went, responsible for 48 countries on the continent, and decided that the continent needed to understand the concept of good economic governance. If it understood it, it would have the right economic policies, sound policies, macroeconomic policies that would ensure stability, macroeconomic stability, focus on structural reforms, do sectoral and institutional reforms, get the institutions dynamic and working anchored on the rule of law, invest in critical infrastructure and building of world-class human capital. It would set the stage for growth. And by the way, we actually saw it happen in some of the countries. Paul Kagame would always tell anybody that cares to listen that a lot of what happened in Rwanda, he gives credit to the fact that he has a certain sister called Obi.
Wow.
It's happened in a number of the other countries. I mean, the president of Malawi, or the president of Liberia, or that of Guinea-Conakry. So I was responsible for 48 countries on the continent, together with our team in the Africa region. We actually did push economic reforms across the continent. And because of that push, the economists have called us the basket case that would never be mended. And then, as Africa started growing, as Africa started doing okay, and growth began to move toward an average of 4 to 5%, the highest in many decades, the same economist, my boss, Zolik, who took over from Wolfowitz, at the time that I was leaving the bank, said, if there's any testimony to the work that you and your team did, it is that the same economist now recanted and said, whatever you thought of Africa, think again. We thought it was a hopeless continent, but this is a trajectory of growth because we were hands-on. I say all of this in order for you to understand that I am not that person who does these issues concerning governance on the basis of, oh, I want to be heard, so that my voice will be known, for relevance, I have nothing doing, so I have to make noise. All of that is the noise of the marketplace. Doesn't define me. This is a consistent commitment to the idea that our continent, our country, has no business being laggards in development. We have no business being laggards. There's no rocket science to development. Countries have gone within 5 decades from poverty to upper income economies. We've seen it happen. We now know that it happens. So what is it about us that has damned us to the dismal results that we have had in governance? And when I was in government, I modeled that belief, what do you call it? That sense of that conviction that it could be done. That's why no matter how difficult the reforms were, one had to push forward with teams to do the reforms. And when people say, oh, what is it even in government that makes people not to succeed when they go there? I say, no, don't put it like that. It depends on what is driving you. All kinds of resistance were put on my part. I told the story of how, in those days they would try to frustrate what we were doing with the public procurement reform, with the due process. First, they started calling me Madam Due Process, some of it out of mockery, some of it out of the ones who called me Madam Due Process out of, a commendation for the work where I knew them. The ones who called me just as out of mockery because they knew I didn't like to be called Madam Due Process, I also knew them. So I was telling the story of how the National Assembly would want to wear me out. So every day, one committee or the other would invite me to come and explain what was obvious. Ministries used to just package contracts for themselves and for the boys. But with the due process system, it was impossible to do so. And so we had technical team. It was a structured process. It was, I normally explain it to people that we so structured the way of the review. Every contract that was above a certain threshold needed to have almost an 18-page report of the evaluation of the process to see how it satisfied international competitive bid standard of requirement of transparency, competitiveness, fairness, and cost competitiveness. So it was a very sound work, but they wanted to wear me out. And one of the days I realized what the whole aim was, because they invited me to this committee, the finance and this thing, and economic committee at that time. And it was myself and Adam Mushioma, who was the Minister of Finance there. Oh, he was such a lovely man. He would say to me, you don't know how much work you're doing. I'm so proud of the work. They were trying to create confusion. They would say to him, oh, she shouldn't really be doing, this is a finance function. It should be in the Ministry of Finance. And he says to them, I don't need it in the Ministry of Finance. I like it where it is, and I like the work she's doing. So you get allies in government and you're good. He was an ally. So they invited us, and by the time they were telling us why they asked me to explain why the budget should not be more, the capital budget should not be more. That because they want to take 1 billion at that time, the total national reserve, the foreign reserve of the country was, I think, less than $6 billion, and they wanted to take 1 billion out of it. I said, what are you taking? It's already been monetized. So there is no, it's not a savings. that reserve that you're thinking of taking, basic economics is important for all political leaders in our country. That we must do. When I get elected, everybody will go through economics 101 in the country, because we need to be on the same wavelength, really, because they saw 5 billion and decided, if we just take 1 billion from it and we'll just increase the capital budget. And I said, you're just going to be printing money. That money has already been spoken for. Yes, it's been fiscalized and you've already spent it. So you want to do a double dip, that's going to ruin the economy. And after I explained, the chairman just sat down, adjusted his agbada and said to me, Madam, due process. When are you going back to Harvard? That was his response. It was like, when are you going back to where you came from? You see, that mindset is the mindset of our failure of all of you and I. We failed because we gave a bunch of fellows who do not even understand certain concepts the sense of entitlement that governance belongs to them. That's why when some people, like someone like me, I come out for politics, you would see somebody who has no basis to even insult you. He will say, what do you know about politics? You think that politics is speaking grammar. Why do you think they say that? They believe that they are the ones entitled to politics, that you and I are supposed to be somewhere speaking grammar. And why that every of us who thinks that politics is beneath us will be governed by our inferiors. That's the story of our country and the story of Africa. Because I saw it. Technical people like myself and my colleagues that were in government during that era, that were known as the economic team of the president, we did all that technical work. As we were working, some of them would just be doing like this. Let them finish. One of them told me that they normally have this discussion where they're saying, let her be saving all that money. By the time they go, we shall show them how to spend money. Politics was disconnected from the governance measures that we technically were taking. So one of the deputy speakers of the country saw me one day. He came to the villa and he said, we got talking, hello, and then we got talking. And then he said to me, Madam Due Process, I like all these reforms you people are doing. I like it. But what I need to ask you is, why now? Did you get it? Why now meant, why should it be during my own time that you're doing all these your reforms? They didn't like the due process. They didn't like monetization. They didn't like